Hey, you lovely lot, and welcome back to Crime Analyst and the Intelligence Cell. Today, I want to talk to you about a really important case, and that's the case of Colin Pitchfork. And I'm going to get straight into it because there's no time to lose. Colin Pitchfork is a double child killer, a serial rapist, stalker, and serial flasher. And he is about to be released. He's about to be released from prison. And I'm extremely concerned about that decision, particularly as he killed two children, Lynda Mann in 1983 and Dawn Ashworth in 1986. And I want to tell you about both Lynda and Dawn, and I want to explain to you why I believe that it's a flawed decision by the Parole Board to release Colin Pitchfork. And I also want to share with you what you can do. I need your help, crime analysts. We all need to be activists, and we can take action in this case because the Lord Chancellor, the Justice Secretary, Alec Jeffrey, has 21 days to act, to rigorously review this decision and to make sure the I's have been dotted and the T's have been crossed. And I have grave concerns about this decision, not just because of the fact that Lynda and Dawn's family are going through pure hell with this every time he comes up for parole, but also because of the extent of his offending behaviour. And I believe that Colin Pitchfork is a psychopath, and I want to share with you why. So we have to go back in time to understand what he did and how he did it, and the scale and scope of his offending behaviour. And I want to tell you a story about what he did and how he did it. And I hope that it would galvanise you into action, because you can write to the Lord Chancellor and Justice Secretary Alec Jeffrey. I'll tell you more about that at the end of this video. Before I get into it, I just also want to thank you for subscribing to Crime Analyst. I really appreciate you subscribing, you commenting, and your super thanks. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. These are real cases told by a real professional. It's real story telling for a purpose, and we can all be activists. And we all need to take action on this one. Okay, so the case against Colin Pitchfork. I want to take you back to Narborough, Leicester in 1983, in November. So it was winter when Lynda Mann left her home. 15-year-old Lynda Mann. I want to keep drawing your attention to the fact that she was a child, as was Dawn. And she went out having had an argument with her sister, and she took her red scarf with her. She never returned home. And her family were frantic, so worried about her because that was unusual. And her body was found the next day. Now, her body was found in undergrowth on a pathway, just off the side of a pathway. And that pathway was to a psychiatric hospital. And it was this footpath, actually, that was important in both cases, because Dawn's body was found 3 years later, very close to that footpath. And Lynda had been raped, she had been strangled, and she had been murdered. She was strangled with the scarf that she was wearing, and it's the pathologist's belief that she was raped post-mortem. Now, the reason I say that is because that makes a difference in terms of the psychopathology of the perpetrator. You have to think about the very act of stalking and killing a child, raping a child, and raping the child post-mortem. And that's particularly concerning. It puts us into the necrophilia world, so raping dead bodies. And that's a very concerning paraphilia. Well, unfortunately, Lynda's killer wasn't caught. 3 years would go by, and another girl, 15-year-old Dawn Ashworth, disappeared, and she was found dead, close to the same footpath, which ran alongside this psychiatric hospital. And the whole community was terrorised and terrified of what was happening. And I know that because some of them have messaged me and contacted me. And Dawn had been strangled, raped, and murdered. Now, what I can tell you, knowing some of the details about this case, is that no perpetrator wakes up one day and stalks and abducts and rapes and murders children like this. There is always a history. And it took some time to find the killer. Now, we know who did it, and that's Colin Pitchfork. And how he was caught was through DNA profiling. So this is the first case that DNA profiling was used. The senior investigating officer was Detective Chief Superintendent David Baker, and he wondered whether you could profile cases on blood group, but also semen. Semen was left at both scenes. So this is the strongest type of DNA, particularly when it's found on a child in a case like this. And the police did have a suspect in mind, and it was a young offender. And as it turned out, they turned to a scientist called Alec Jeffrey, and he profiled both cases, Lynda and Dawn. He realised that the semen was identical in both cases. He also profiled it against a sample of this young individual that they had in mind and found out that it wasn't him. But the other thing that they discovered was the profile was quite rare, and it would belong to only 10% of the population. So that was very fortuitous. And Detective Chief Superintendent David Baker decided to do the first DNA intelligence-led screen. Now, they wrote over 5,000 letters to men in the locality. They believed him to be local, and quite right too, given the crime scene, given the geographic location. And they were right. They requested that men aged between 18 and 34, the letters that they wrote to these men instructed them to come forward and to give their blood. And that happened, but sometime down the line, they still hadn't got a match until something very interesting happened. And it was a conversation that took place in a pub. And a man called Ian Kelly was telling his co-workers about a man that he worked with. And the man he worked with was a baker. They were bakers. And he had mentioned that he had been given some money by this individual to go and give his blood in his place. And that's what he did. They switched passports, they doctored the passport, and he went and gave blood in his place because Colin Pitchfork had told him that he had given his blood for another man who had been arrested for indecently exposing himself, and therefore could Ian Kelly please give blood on his behalf. I mean, let's just think about the bro culture for now, that he would do this for another man who had indecently exposed himself, and then this third person, Ian Kelly, would do this. That is just bonkers to me, but we know this sort of thing happens. And just think about the kernel of truth in there about indecently exposing. I'm going to come on to that in a minute because that was a kernel of truth and leakage. But he told this story to his co-workers, and the supervisor, a female, was sat there listening, and it did not sit well with her. And just think about that. It was a woman who found this extremely uncomfortable. Other co-workers didn't, bro culture, but she did. And she told a local policeman about it. And within, I think it was one day, Colin Pitchfork was arrested. And if it hadn't have been for DNA profiling, I wonder whether he actually would have been caught. He was very devious, very manipulative, and he did not want to be caught. That's very important. He tried to evade capture. When he was interviewed, he shared that he had been offending from his early teenage years. And he also shared that he had indecently exposed himself to more than 1,000 women. Just think about that. So there was a kernel of truth in what he said to his co-worker, Ian Kelly, but the fact that he was so prolific in his offending behaviour, that makes sense to me, because no man wakes up and just decides to stalk, abduct and rape and kill a child. I've never seen it yet in 27 years. But it's also very important when we think about the fact that he pled guilty to the 2 rapes and murders of Lynda and Dawn, also to another indecent assault of a female, and he pled guilty to perverting the course of justice. He pled guilty because his offending behaviour was far more extensive, and that's what I know about serial perpetrators and also about psychopaths. When their back's against the wall, they will confess to what they need to, but they won't give you any more. But it's also very instructive also when we think about his offending behaviour and risk. Ergo, if someone goes to prison for 2 rapes and murders, 1 indecent assault, and perverting the course of justice, they're only being assessed on that small portion of offending behaviour. And they're only most likely being assessed on risk for that small portion of offending behaviour, not all the other hundreds of offences they most likely would have committed. And we know that from Colin Pitchfork's own words, he committed more offences. And that's where we have to understand risk far better, particularly when we think about sexual pathology and when we think about psychopathy and psychopathology. That's a lot of long words that I'm throwing in there, but it's really important. He was assessed, it was court mandated that a psychiatrist assess him, and the court report did state that he was a psychopath. So he was diagnosed as a psychopath, and also he was diagnosed as having a serious psychosexual pathology, and that he was extremely dangerous. This is the most dangerous type of perpetrator, in my experience. And I always ask about psychopathy because often it's not assessed for. And the thing with psychopaths is that they are pathological liars. They don't tell the truth. They will tell you anything, whatever you want to hear, for them to have their needs met or for them to get out of prison. They are very good at reading emotional temperatures of people. They are very plausible. They have no empathy. They have no remorse. They have no responsibility taken. But the lack of empathy makes them incredibly dangerous. So these are things that I did a Radio 5 live interview with Stephen Nolan on Friday the 16th, and I talked about my concerns about the Parole Board's decision to release him. I questioned whether he had been assessed for psychopathy and whether he had been assessed for his stalking behaviour using the stalking risk profile. And I questioned that because oftentimes people think that the I's have been dotted and the T's have been crossed, but in my professional career, I don't always find that that's the case. What I do find is that psychopaths and very dangerous psychopaths, like I believe Colin Pitchfork is, are able to manipulate. They are very devious. They are able to persuade others that they are safe. They're able to pull the wool over the eyes of professionals. And that's exactly what the senior investigating officer, David Baker, said that Colin Pitchfork would do. And now here we are in 2023, and a decision has been made to release him. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that the Lord Chief Justice at the time of sentencing said that from the point of view of public safety, it was unlikely that Colin Pitchfork would be released. He was given 2 life sentences, but unfortunately that then translated to him serving a minimum of 30 years, which he has now done. And also in 2009, due to exceptional progress, those 30 years were reduced to 28. And full disclosure, I haven't seen the 1,000-page report that the Parole Board have based their decision on, but I would imagine that it talks about programs that he's been on and responded well to. I would imagine that it talks about his good behaviour. He's probably been the model prisoner. I would imagine that it talks to the fact that he got a degree. It talks to the fact that he is an excellent painter and sculptor. And it most likely talks to the fact that he's been translating music into Braille for blind people, and about his release to open prison in 2016, that he's been released with conditions, and so far, so good. But we know in 2021 that he was recalled due to some behaviour talking to girls and women and doing breathing exercises to cheat the polygraph. And now there are reasons that have been given for those things, but I'm still very concerned about his behaviour, given how chameleon-esque he is. I'm concerned about the fact that he has changed his name twice and he's changed his appearance. So we won't know what he looks like. We won't know what his name is. And I've also just learned, absolutely alarmingly, that he's been training as a carer. And he's been training as a carer to care for disabled people. I am literally beside myself with this. Disabled people who are vulnerable, who will be dependent upon him. Well, what, given that he's been learning Braille, what if he chooses girls and women who aren't sighted, who can't see, who are blind? What if he chooses those who can't speak, who are unable to say what's happened? What if that's the plan here? And I just cannot believe that someone or a number of professionals think that this is okay if this is true. It is not okay for him to be around the most vulnerable. They need us to speak up for them. It is not okay. So I am deeply concerned about this decision. And as I said, if he is a psychopath, which I believe him to be, now, again, I haven't diagnosed him, but the court-mandated report, the psychiatrist did diagnose him, and I can't believe that that's changed. We know with psychopaths, we know that there's no cure, there's no treatment. They cannot be rehabilitated. That's why there's a psychopath unit, a psychopathy unit. They can mimic emotions. They can say all the right things. They can gauge the emotional temperature. They can emulate. They can mimic it back, but they don't genuinely feel contrite or remorse or empathy. It is an act. They are the most dangerous types of offenders. And that's why most psychopaths like Levi Belfield, he's got 4 life sentences, whole life sentences. He won't be released. If Lynda and Dawn's cases happen present day, I'm confident that he would have received 2 whole life tariffs. He would not be released. So why is it that women and girls' safety is being devalued? Why is it that women and girls should pay the price? That if he comes out, and let's say he's given all these 40 conditions that he has to live by, if he has so many conditions, that tells me he's not safe to be released. Why are they taking this huge gamble? And I really hope that you do take the time, as a crime analyst, as an activist, as an advocate, to email Alex Chalk. His address will be in the show notes. He's the Lord Chancellor and Justice Secretary who will rigorously review this decision. The clock's ticking. It was 21 days, and now we're down to far less. So please do email him, and please ask and question whether he's been assessed for psychopathy, whether the assessment is flawed and that you believe it to be flawed and that it's not in the public interest for him to be released because of public safety and the risk to women and girls, and that you want him to intervene. When you email him that, you'll see that the email will ping back to you, and it will say, if this is for the Ministry of Justice, for his role in the Ministry of Justice, please click here. So please click there and make sure it goes to him at the Ministry of Justice, as he has a dual role. So I'm going to leave it there. I've talked for far longer because, as you can tell from my heart, I feel for Lynda and for Dawn and for their families. I also am concerned about future girls and women, and I want to make sure that girls and women are protected and that this isn't just lip service. So please take action. Thank you so much for listening to me. I'm going to end thinking about Lynda and Dawn and their families. Until next time, be curious, ask questions, and always trust your instincts.